Do aliens walk among us? Do they reside on secretive military bases? And do they dress in elaborate disguises and gamble in Las Vegas? All outlandish claims, but one man named Charles Hall would state that not only are these things true, but that he himself lived and worked alongside alien beings on the Air Force base known as Nellis in Las Vegas, Nevada, and the secretive facility known as Area 51. My name is Aaron Deese, and back for another episode of UFOs Revisited are Ron Murphy, Heather Mosier, Katie Page, Micah Hanks, and Mark Matsky. Welcome back, everyone.
Always a pleasure.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So this is an interesting one. This is going to be a fun conversation because, again, some of the cases we discuss get very serious and they have some dark tones to them. There are some lighthearted aspects to this one, you might say, that I think we'll enjoy talking about. But let's break it down. This story seems to originate from a series of books known as Millennial Hospitality, which were written by a man named Charles Hall. They were originally presented as fiction. The fourth book in the series revealed that the entire saga was factual and that this was Mr. Hall's way of getting it out into the world to enlighten people as to the truth. Nellis Air Force Base is located in Las Vegas. It is just a few hours from Area 51, as we just mentioned. This is the base that Mr. Hall is supposed to have been stationed out of when he was hired in 1965 as an Air Force weather observer. This is the setup. This is the premise. What happened next? What do we know about this case?
Well, from my understanding, he was taken to Area 51, and I believe there were I want to say 46 other weather observers before him that didn't last very long.
In 7 years.
In 7 years, so a heavy turnaround rate. And he was giving full reign of not only Area 51, but S4. So long as he was alone, he could go anywhere on the base he wanted to.
Yeah, let's talk about that first. I'm glad you brought that up early. This is an interesting juxtaposition to other cases we hear about where persons have allegedly had access to secret government facilities, because Mr. Hall says he was allowed to go anywhere as long as no one else was with him. Can anyone think of a reason why that would make sense?
The cooperation of any kind. He can't say, hey, you can't prove a story to be factual or, fiction. Yeah, so, but again, logically, you would think he could go anywhere on the base if somebody was with him, right? That would make sense because how do you know your way around a base? You're just going to be, walking all over through this labyrinthine type of situation trying to find your way out. Doesn't make any sense to me at all. Yeah.
Checking the doorknob.
Exactly, right. What's in here? What's in here? So, what happens if you have to go to the bathroom? Where do you find your way to that? It just doesn't make logical sense.
Yeah.
And if you're observing the weather, you could be anywhere on the base and you're seeing.
Right.
Why would you need access?
Why would you need access? Exactly. That's right. The weather's not inside the base.
Yeah. And again, we if we talk about other cases, of course, it's hard to mention Area 51 without talking about Bob Lazar. Mr. Lazar states implicitly that he was given access only to areas as needed, and other people that have worked with government intelligence agencies that, multiple members of our panel have spoken to have corroborated that they tell you what you need to know. So a weather observer who, as we've said, may not even need access to the base, maybe could just be jeeped out to a tower or something. I don't know. I don't know how a weather observer's job works, but that's an interesting detail of this story that I think is obviously worth talking about right off the bat. It's fascinating.
Does he ever comment on the reason why himself? Because I having seen a couple video interviews with him, he's made that claim, but he's never really stated why in those contexts that I've seen. I'm a weather observer, and this is why I need access to everywhere. You would think at some point you would want to justify that level of clearance or access.
It was left somewhat nebulous. It does seem, though, I think that in one case he had at least mentioned that he had to be by himself because had there been anyone with him, there would have been consequences, we might say. He seemed to have kind of alluded to the idea that those individuals might even have been exterminated. And so it's a little strange, again, why he's given free reign, full access, has to go all by himself. And although he did discuss that a couple of times, it seemed to always be kind of vague. And naturally his own personal experiences that he claimed to have had there, initially written about as fiction, but then later revealed to have purportedly been fact. It's some strange stuff that he even found disconcerting. He was not very comfortable with the circumstances he found himself in.
Were he a maintenance worker or janitorial staff, something along those lines, I could see that. But it's interesting, that position compared to that apparent level of access. Yeah. You got a lot of disparate points to cover in this one, so.
And what kind of clearances do you need to do that too? You would think that there's not just, you're going to go there to be a weather observer and all of a sudden you have carte blanche to the whole thing. I mean, there has to be clearances you have to go through.
Presumably that would be a majestic clearance level.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah.
So that would be even beyond the president then, correct? Right. Yeah.
Well, unless you're Nixon or Jackie Gleason.
Oh, right.
Or Eisenhower. Yes. Well, this is another, I'm glad you guys mentioned those even in jest, because this is another case that seemingly overlaps with a lot of other disparate cases and reports that we'll discuss as we go. But it's more what Hall alleges to have seen at Area 51 than his apparent level of access that I think is what has generated so much fascination about this case. Hall alleges to have encountered extraterrestrial beings who were living in semi-permanent installations on the Area 51 base. Again, we have seen this in other places. We saw this in our discussion of Planet Serpo. It's rumored that there were perhaps survivors of the Roswell crash. Those are just two cases that have another interconnectivity that come to mind. But can you guys think of any other cases where this has been purported, that we have extraterrestrials living on Earth?
Yeah, something I found interesting about this case is the fact that he states that these tall whites would come down and vacation on planet Earth, and they would only come during full moon. Now, I found that little thing, what is that about and why the full moon? And so much so that they come vacation, that their parenting style, they're really proud of what great parents they are. They're very protective of their children. And sometimes they like to dress up and go into Vegas and gamble. So
yeah.
It's a vacation spot, apparently.
An appropriate way to greet them was something along the lines of, hello, you were a better parent than I am.
Yes.
Yeah, they have very specific rules on how to interact with them, or you could end up killed. You weren't to startle them or anything like that. And he worked alongside them too. From what I understand, part of the deal was that they were teaching each other how to work with one another in a more harmonious way. So again, be very careful.
So if I were a species that wanted to be talked kindly to and not be startled, the last place I would go would be to a Vegas casino.
That's an interesting thought, because as Heather said, Hall alleges that he was told to be very careful around these beings, don't insult or surprise them, because it seemed that they were able to act with impunity. They were pretty much able to do whatever they wanted. One aspect of the account I found interesting is that they had these implements that were like pencils or pens or wands or something like that, and they would zap you with them. Which is something else that will come up in some of the other cases we'll discuss.
Yeah.
But it right away gets into some very, I hate to fall back on this because we've mentioned it a few times, but it gets into some very sci-fi narrative territory.
It gets into alien technology very quickly, doesn't it? Yeah, they're here, but they're utilizing and they're operating under their rules, right? So it's still that kind of stranger in a strange land thing. They're not completely assimilated, but they're here for whatever reason. Apparently vacationing here for one day a month. Yeah.
And that is, if I could just throw this in there, that is the dark undertone of this story that otherwise would be very almost entertaining, with this idea of, going into Las Vegas and gambling. There is this element of great danger. and death. I mean, there's the turnover in the weather operators or observers themselves, and there is an account, isn't this part of the story that Hall himself gets zapped
Yes.
and left for dead?
Yes.
And then they're kind of surprised that he's still alive. I mean,
And they respect that he's alive. too.
yeah. Oh, you know,
We
you're,
meant to kill you, but if you live, you know.
we'll grudgingly respect
that. That's
you
right.
now.
That's right.
Yes, he received some kind of telepathic communication
Yeah.
saying, I believe some of the exact words were, "We have power over you and expect you to die." Like, it was very specific, but that they would respect him if he survived.
It's a wild mix.
They must really respect him. I mean, here he is, you know.
They must.
Yes.
Now, it might also be helpful to discuss a little bit about the specifics, you know, what these beings that he claimed he encountered were like, what he said they looked like, what his interactions with them were like. When Hall first arrives out there and he's conducting his job as a weather observer, he says the first time he observed what he begins calling the tall whites, he was terrified. He's very frightened. Although they didn't look all that different, he said, from humans. He said that maybe from a distance they would almost appear like they are bald, but that they actually had very fine light-colored hair that sometimes, in certain cases, you couldn't see until they were up close, and hence the donning of disguises when they head into Vegas, you know, to play the slot machines. But he said that their eyes, you know, were maybe a little larger than ours, but again, evidently not so much so that they couldn't blend in with humans under certain circumstances. A little taller than us, too, and hence, I guess, the terminology, you know, tall whites. But he describes in many cases being very frightened when they come close to him, even though often his interactions initially are pretty innocuous. You know, a woman with its child coming down and saying, "Do you mind if the child plays here? Is the child going to bother you?" And invariably, if the tall whites come and ask you if their children are going to bother you, you say, no, it's just fine. Have them there. It's no problem. I'm just working for the government right now. No problem. So, but Charles, of course, goes into these stories about his interactions. Generally, the ones that were identified as, you know, the women and their children were pretty friendly. Some of the males were a little more stoic, sometimes even intimidating, you know, not the kind of people that you wanted to mess around with a whole lot. Yeah, and so the way he describes these interactions in itself is kind of interesting. And yes, of course, being left for dead and told he'll be respected if he survives. It does sound an awful lot like a kind of a science fiction story, and that was the real, I think, surprise there, that you get a few stories in to find that, well, actually, folks, this is all, in fact, true. It's all been taking place out there. Charles Hall isn't the only person who claims to have seen non-human intelligences in the general vicinity of Nellis Air Force Base, Area 51, Las Vegas. Of course, probably one of the more famous instances of alleged extraterrestrial presences and technology is Bob Lazar, who only said he saw one time something that he couldn't explain that might have been alien-like. And it's hard to base the brief description of Lazar seeing something going down a hallway with its head turned. So it is a little difficult, I think, to kind of compare what Bob Lazar saw to Charles Hall's very vivid, very descriptive accounts of these beings that he purportedly encountered. But what you can't dispute is that the tall whites are probably the most descriptive account of any kind of an alien associated with the Area 51 complex that I know of.
Right. Well, can we tie this into Phil Schneider and the Eisenhower meeting with these whites or Nordics? Are they the same species? That's
That's a good question. I don't know. I wondered this, but if you watch Walking with the Tall Whites, he talks about 3 types of aliens that he met, and he says the Norwegians with 24 teeth. So, okay. The Greys from Roswell, and then the tall whites. But there were the Norwegians with 24 teeth, so I don't know.
so interesting.
Well, that does sort of sound like a callback then to the other
Right.
two, because again, we've continued to note these different varieties, the Nordics, which again, those and the Greys seemingly appear in cases like Travis Walton's abduction, but they're
Right.
popularly associated with the Eisenhower meetings from 1954. So Hall acknowledges those two tropes, but then establishes, independent of those, the tall whites, something completely unto themselves and different. Interesting.
And I think it's important to maybe take a look at Charles Hall himself. And I know there's been some disputes on being able to prove his military service. So that's an important fact as well.
So what do we know about that?
He will not produce a DD-214. And it's been controversial, to say the least. And I think it's also proven that some of the photographs that he has presented do not match the weapons, the uniforms, the things at the time. So there's really no proof that he served at all.
So some discrepancies.
Some discrepancy in his uniform.
No,
Yeah.
DD-214. Kevin Randall and other researchers have written about a phenomenon that I think is worthy of being mentioned here, stolen valor.
That's exactly.
People who have claimed to have served in a certain time or have been present during certain events, and it turns out after the fact they can't substantiate that, and in fact may not be telling the truth. Now, I don't want to insert that that's what's happening, but
Right.
I mentioned that that has occurred in other instances in ufology, and there have been researchers who have found that kind of thing.
Yeah, David Adair
Yeah.
for in point.
Right, yeah.
Stolen valor.
Yes.
Did he not then serve in Vietnam in '68? I think he, by his own recollection, says he went.
I
on
tried to do
Vietnam.
some digging on that, and
Yeah.
I could find no proof of that.
See, that's interesting because that's part of his. But that. So to your point, that's that would seem to be a matter of record. You know, who served in Vietnam? I don't know. But
You would assume so. I don't know either, but you would assume.
Yeah. Keep in mind, part of the story was he had to be alone while he was at Nellis Air Force Base, so you have nobody to ask, do you know this person? But in Vietnam, that's a little bit different because you would have friends and you would have associations there as well. Yeah.
Well, there are, so it obviously kind of goes without saying there are some holes here in the story. There is some room to speculate as to its validity, but there are additional cases and anecdotes which might correlate some of what Mr. Hall said. Did you have some?
No, I was going to say there is absolutely no holes in the story if this is fiction. Right. It's only whenever he claims it's fact that the holes start showing up.
Yeah. And you do have to think from a marketing perspective, there are a lot of very obscure science fiction stories and series that are put into publication for a little bit and then fade into obscurity, and then you're getting them off the dollar clearance bin at your local bookstore. I love those books. Hall did something that, if it was a marketing ploy, was actually kind of brilliant in waiting until he had these other books out and saying, actually, it's all real, as made evident by the fact that we're discussing it right now. Perhaps some people, after they watch this, will go and purchase it. You know, I'm not telling you to or not to, but in a way, there's a little bit of brilliance to that.
It's sort of reminiscent of like found footage, you know, right? Oh, we found this strange, mysterious tape laying out here in the forest, and we popped it in the VCR, presuming it happened in the 1990s or something, right? Unless you still watch VCR just for fun like I do. And, there's this story of a Blair Witch, or there's this story of something that happened, or it's a lost NASA tape, it's something that happened during a secret Apollo mission. That's, you know, something that we actually see from time to time. The presentation of fictional material intended to look like it's real and maybe left ambiguous enough so that people kind of wonder. And there have been some infamous cases in filmmaking history where that sometimes, you know, even led to some controversy. But it's not unlike what we're seeing with Charles Hull. Fiction, maybe some of it's true. Leave them wondering. It generates intrigue.
Well, another, you know, pretty well-known work that we've talked about on this show before, The Shaver Mystery, kind of falls into a similar category where it's presented as fiction. Many people believe it's fiction, but what about this? What if this? You know, there are people who believe that it's an actual historical document. So I think we see something kind of similar here, you know, not a one-for-one parallel.
You know, another layer to his resume and another parallel to Lazar is the fact that he claimed degrees in both nuclear physics and thermal physics and a business degree. So once again, there are things that would presumably be identifiable, or you could trace those down if you had the wherewithal to do it. And I don't know that that's been attempted, but it seems like that's very Lazarian, if you will, to have all these things that you've claimed, and are they provable or not?
And maybe a little bit too overqualified to be a meteorologist. Yeah.
Heather, do you have anything that you could say about the accessibility of those kinds of documents, people's degrees, and, you know, how difficult it is to research?
I've never actually tried to look into someone's academic records, but it should be something that would be pretty readily available. I mean, everybody has access to their own academic transcripts if you just call the college and ask for it. So I don't think that it would be that difficult. And then as far as, and we've talked about this before, as far as being able to verify that somebody was at school or at a university, you have other humans around, one, to verify that. You've got your dorm mates, your roommates, you've got yearbooks, Even when you go to graduate, they have a whole list of who the graduates are. So there's documentation out there to be had. It's just a matter of finding it.
Right. And even if there would be a government conspiracy to erase this person completely, there is still going to be human interaction, that somebody has a picture of him.
Right.
Or like you said, graduate. Exactly. That's right. That's right.
Yeah. As interesting as all of this is, there are some other cases that seem to have some commonalities, or maybe even provide a little bit of validation to what Hall is alleged to have witnessed. There was a recent sighting in Las Vegas that went extremely viral online. It's still being talked about. This is in 2023, where someone called 911 and reported seeing tall, humanoid, but he specifically says not human, figures in his backyard. The exact description is a little bit vague, but at least at the surface, at least with that, they seem to resemble these tall whites, tall, not quite human, humanoid figures. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Do we want to talk about that?
How tall are we talking about for a tall white?
Does anyone know? That's a good question.
Sort of think maybe
I think
7.
7. I was thinking 7, 8.
Yeah.
One thing Hall did state is that they age imperceptibly, but they get so tall at around 800 years of age that their organs fail.
Their organs fell, right? So are we talking, yeah. Well, I know that there have been studies on how this shape, right? The shape can only do so much, right? And I think the top is like, once you get to about 8 feet, that's almost impossible for your body, this kind of style, to operate. The organs and everything like that, and just to pump blood through that. Of course, we're dealing with a non-Earth species as well, too, so we don't know how that operates. But you would think that if you get up to the level of about 8 feet tall, it's going to be very hard to be inconspicuous, right? Yeah, so that's kind of one of the problems that I have.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point.
In that case that you mentioned, Aaron, was there anything said about interaction would just observe the figures in his backyard? Because it clearly in the story that Hall is telling, there's intelligence, there's communication going on almost always. It'd be interesting to know in that modern case if there was a similar interaction, or if it was just figures that were spotted.
I believe it was just a visual sighting. I may be mistaken, but I believe it was just a visual sighting. And one of the things that's been interesting about it is one of the responding police officers apparently saw a strange light in the sky. There's body cam footage of this, where he asked one of the other residents of the neighborhood, "Did you guys see that?" I think that light was identified. I think it was determined to be a satellite or something. But admittedly, I don't have detailed notes on that case.
I don't.
Is this the one that has video footage attached to it as well? Okay.
Yeah, there's
Just making sure
audio of the
being the same.
911 call, there's the police officer's footage, and I believe the individual who reported the sighting, whose name I can't remember, has done a couple follow-up videos, which, when it goes that viral, of course, someone's going to do a follow-up.
And I think he already regrets calling 911. Yeah. So
I've heard differing takes on that case, but its proximity to Nellis Air Force Base and Area 51, and just that similarity in description, to me, I found that very striking. Interestingly enough, also in 2014, about 10 years ago at time of recording, a YouTuber named David Hilton would go on Google Maps and start looking at the Nevada desert around the area that Hall is alleged to have worked at. He had read his works and seen the documentary, became very, very interested in them. And he located some very strange structures out in the desert which seemed to match Hall's description of the tall white scout crafts, which I believe were rounded egg-like objects. Hilton actually submitted a FOIA request to the Air Force requesting more information about the area in question, and was basically told the documents you're asking for do not fall under FOIA. We're not going to tell you anything. I have a couple takes on that, but what do you guys think?
Not surprised that certain structural elements, out there in this very secure area and associated with a highly secretive facility, that would be exempt from FOIA is not strange at all. I mean, there's a lot of information that's exempt from Freedom of Information Act request. Having filed a lot of FOIAs, I know that unless you're very specific about what you're asking for and diligent sometimes in your follow-up questions, you're probably, when looking for that kind of thing, more likely to get a rejection, denial, no records found, or this is exempt from FOIA, then you are likely to get the response in terms of what you're looking for. And it's also been pointed out, I think, that if you go online trying to look at these secure facilities, I mean, commercially available satellite technology most often blanks out those areas. And that's something that has to be discussed too. I mean, you're not going to have ready access to that. And in the past, even when people would hike to the top of Tikaboo Peak, I think you'd mentioned, Katie, that you can't go up there any longer.
No, they closed.
Or at the very least, you're not supposed to. I've heard of people doing that. And even on certain television shows, people hiking up there and helicopters and jets buzz them.
Right.
They don't
Camo
like-
dudes will arrest you and take you down.
So, you know, I mean, and similarly, if you go to the Area 51 gate, you know, you always hear about the SUV that parks at the top of the hill. They don't like people coming out there and poking around and doing things. And if you cross that boundary and you enter, I mean, there's a famous sign that says deadly force may be used in the event of unauthorized access. So, I mean, for reasons very obvious, in terms of national security and protecting the American way of life, there is a great degree of secrecy about these things. And so, not surprising at all that FOIA requests would be denied about them.
And apparently there was some back and forth between Mr. Hilton and the agencies he contacted where they requested additional information, additional details. You know, I don't have the full breakdown of that. And that was a point that I was hoping would come up. Government facilities, even just, you know, the Air Force Base that's downtown in your city of choice. If you go on Google Maps and look, those images are obscured. Otherwise, any hostile entity anywhere in the world could download a tactical map of any U.S. facility. You can't do that. So the images that Mr. Hilton captured or that he found on Google Maps are interesting, but then it kind of takes me to another line of speculation. Well, what might they actually be working on out there that we've identified these weird-looking structures? And that is probably a conversation for another day. We talked a little bit about underground bases in the past and what that might mean.
Yeah, and Google Maps and Google Earth are not perfect either. I mean, there's artifacts and weird video sort of anomalies that appear there just as part of the program still. I mean, there's a difference, right, between commercially available satellite technology and other more advanced things.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get, you know, like a hand sticking out of a window or something, just weird screen captures as part of that.
Yeah.
Did Mr. Hall describe the craft? You mentioned the egg-shaped craft. Reminds me of Mork from or even the Socorro craft. Maybe these were children. I don't know. But, I mean, we do hear of this egg-shaped craft or scouting
It
craft.
comes up in
So
other
that's
cases.
kind of
That's-
interesting.
yeah.
Mork from Mork. And did they wear clothing other than heels and pumps and, you know, whatever to go to Vegas? I don't know if they had suits or...
I'm glad you said that because there's an interesting case that I can't recall the name of. I can look it up on my phone, but out of Australia where a family was traveling by vehicle and they witnessed a large egg-shaped craft that actually levitated their vehicle off of the ground. And I believe this was a family with young children. So that's interesting. Just occurred to me. Egg-shaped craft, children, tall white children. I don't know.
Also, to go along that line of thinking, considering, you know, any culture now becomes a cosmopolitan culture, worldwide culture, but this is very reminiscent of the Coneheads from Saturday Night Live as well, too. These are people that don't look anything like us whatsoever, yet we're supposed to believe that they can, assimilate. That's right, even though it makes no logical sense. But you could see an episode of them going into Vegas, right? I mean, you can see that completely. So I'm wondering how much of our collective culture is playing into this story as well.
We have other examples. There's that sitcom, Third Rock from the Sun.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's the recent show with Alan Tudyk, Resident Alien, very entertaining, but it all runs along that same line of aliens living in disguise.
A fish out of water type of thing. And in a way, then we can relate to what's going on through that as well, too, if we're in an unusual or awkward situation. But yeah, there's learning moments into these kind of things. But I'm thinking, as we look at these cases, now it would have been different if this was in the 1950s, but because it's such a modern case, I'm wondering how much of our entertainment is playing into the fabrication of these books.
Well, now there is a rumor, of course, that the creators of the Coneheads for Saturday Night Live had actually been briefed on Charles Hall's accounts. Is that true? No.
Wow. That's good.
We have assimilated with the blunt skulls. Affirmative.
Yes.
Very interesting. It's yet another case, and I hate to be too repetitious, but it is yet another case where we see fictitious folklore, modern mythology, if you like, crossing over with other UFO cases that continue to defy a full debunking. And then you have this central figure kind of at the middle of it, whose background may be questionable, but who tells a very, very compelling story.
That's a great point, because I think the modern mythology is something that we have to look at, because it doesn't necessarily have to be true, just like other mythologies. We can still learn a lesson from it, right? And we're immediately we're cast in that everyman who is leading us through this story. That could be us, right? We don't have any business being there, but we could be in his shoes, and we're living kind of vicariously through him as we go through this kind of new world that's now being described to us and now that we're a part of. So I think the idea of myth making is very important, especially when we talk in cases from the 50s, 60s. I mean, it becomes so much ingrained in our culture that it is part of our identity.
Very good points.
Yes.
Very good points. And again, I think a lot of people look at the idea of the insinuation that UFO cases may involve myths or folklore as being, an attempt at debunking or in some way derogatory. I don't see it like that at all. I think to understand the sum totality of the UFO phenomenon, we have to understand a lot of things about human psychology and our tendency to build stories around things. We think about in the ancient world when people presumably sitting around fires at night, they didn't have television. What did they watch every single night? What could they see? And they had a lot of time to spend watching it, stars. And so they paid attention to celestial, appearances and occurrences and things. And there are records that show not only that things like supernova may have been observed by ancient observers and that they kept a good eye on those and they saw comets when they would appear. And they would give them a name like a guest star, something that appears in the sky for a short time and then it goes away. And they may have observed other kinds of aerial anomalies too. We also see archaeological sites with the directional orientation of some of these structures and their celestial orientations. I mean, a lot of fascinating things about the way that people in the ancient world observed the sky, but then they also start to weave narratives around it. That cluster or grouping resembles a scorpion, or this one looks like a large bear and its baby. So the human process of myth-making is one of taking, I think, the raw chaos of reality and uniting it and making a story and making it something we can relate to. And sometimes also telling cultural narratives and stories that we can put to a rhythm and put to a song so that we can remember those tales. Never underestimate the power of the human storytelling faculty to be passed on through successive generations, maybe sometimes represented over centuries or even thousands of years. So all of that to say, we have to understand all that is a big part of what it means to be human. And I think in that modern sense, there are real objects seen, there are real incidents that occur, but humans start to unite the narrative and create kind of continuities that may or may not exist, but understanding that is part of understanding the UFO mystery. I think it's very important.
And I think we see that here for sure with Bob Lazar kind of tying in, Charles Hall, Bill Schneider. It's kind of this, one building on another, and it makes our jobs that much more, entertaining and confusing, and we don't know where to go and what to do with it.
Right. And especially in Hall's case, the amount of time and care that he put into telling the story. I mean, it's a book series. It's not a one-shot, here it is. It's something that was developed over time that whatever happened, he devoted quite a bit of attention to himself in fashioning the story. Yeah. And that shows in the level of detail that's there.
I would love to see a Hall and Lazar buddy film. That would be awesome.
That would be really cool.
A team up to play.
That's right.
And he's such a soft-spoken, innocent-looking man, and you just want to, I believe you, but then...
When you hear him speak, he doesn't, the audio and some of the video clips I've heard, he doesn't come across as a super flamboyant, eccentric character who's, I know the truth. He comes across, much in the way that Bob Lazar does to me, as just a guy telling you what he's experienced.
Yeah.
I mean, the word that comes to mind is sincere. I think a few of us have talked about that. There's this kind of, this look of innocence that he kind of has in his eyes when he's telling these stories. And yes, it just happened kind of like this. And in a way that kind of is disarming, and it kind of draws you in and makes you kind of want to think, gosh, what if? Maybe there is something to this. If they do the buddy film, I got a great title for that. Fear and Loathing at Nellis Air Force Base.
Let's make this happen.
Yeah, he is the Dreamland weather specialist.
Yeah, there we go.
There
we go.
Yeah. And he keeps on commenting on the weather. We got to get there because it's going to rain.
Detailed down to the moment. Well, here's something I wondered about, just kind of reflecting on this, given just the way that Mr. Hall strikes me as a person. I believe he's still alive, if I'm not mistaken. Might he himself been the victim of some kind of an experiment or a misinformation campaign? Might he believe everything that he's saying, and perhaps this was some other way that someone else was trying to see how would a human being respond when placed in close quarters with an extraterrestrial entity?
And how would people respond whenever they hear the story? So that's the nefarious part of all this stuff. All this stuff could be absolutely true. You know, this guy who really came out of nowhere, yeah, you can walk around the base. You know, go ahead, nobody, you know. And then whenever he gets that information, takes it out to the public, how's the public going to respond? You know, that's very possible that could happen.
Because they could reasonably assume, the powers that be could reasonably assume that anyone who heard this story would immediately write it off. So, but this could be an ongoing social experiment just to see what does this story do, whether or not it's true. Maybe he was made to believe he had seen extraterrestrial technology and entities. Maybe he actually did. But either of those could be true, and it could still be some kind of a observational experiment on the part of some, I don't know, that's just an idea.
Based on how sincere he looks and sounds, that would make me extremely sad for him. In general, because that, like, sincerity is true. When you watch him or listen to him, that would be just heartbreaking if that was something that they actually put somebody through.
Yeah.
And think of the resources that would be represented to put someone like Hall in that situation and surround him with things that would cause him to sincerely believe that.
Yeah. Unless this was some kind of, and if we really want to get conspiratorial, but history, you know, maintaining the focus here on history, there's still historic precedent for this, MK Ultra. I mean, is it possible that there have been cases where people, because I've legitimately wondered this, could some people have been misled, not through some crazy orchestration, you know, a Sid and Marty Krofft kind of a structure of, you know, some kind of actors, and it's a whole show that's put on. Instead of that, what if somebody is simply, there's a chemically induced misremembrance, you know, false memories that are induced. And I mean, just what if? What if people like Hall and Lazar and some of the others who have made these extraordinary claims, they seem so convincing because they really do believe what they saw. But again, as a what if, as a hypothetical, they were made to believe that, and it was actually done in a fairly cost-effective way. I mean, let's just induce false memories and see if we can help propagate this myth by people who actually believe what they're saying. I mean, is it crazy to suppose that could happen?
No, and that explains why you can find nothing about their academic records or anything, because they were made to believe that this. Well, that's a little scary, though. I mean, that's terrifying.
It's like Heather's saying, I mean, you feel sorry for someone if that were the case.
Yes.
Of course, that's entirely speculative on our part, but that insinuation has been made. Again, I've even heard others and very, very, you know, credible researchers speculate the same, particularly about people like Bob Lazar.
Right.
And I think Ron said at the beginning, it's easy to disavow somebody like that then, you know, who comes along with the story that I had full reign, I had to be by myself. Well, now it's easy to say, well, you were never here. That's a false claim. There's no proof you were ever here. I mean, imagine what that would do to your own psyche if you are sincere in your belief that you were somewhere, and then your authority figures are telling you, no, you weren't. And that's how we end up with Paul Benowitz and those type of situations. We're very troubled people.
Yeah.
Important tie-in, though, because essentially that's what happened with Benowitz. I mean, they helped cultivate additional belief that was sort of built onto a foundation of his own findings and innate belief in the UFO situation and the pieces he had already been put together. You know, most would look at the Benowitz story and say he was helped along through being fed disinformation, and this culminated in really essentially a mental problem for him. He was eventually committed. His family had this issue. Family members still won't talk about it because they still actually work with some of the very same agencies that Benowitz's business had been contracted and working with at that time. So it affected a family in that case, and that was a very good example, which we don't have to speculate about. Somebody was given bad information, led to believe something. He genuinely believed it, and all that is part of an effort to discredit the broader, you know, UFO narrative.
And that would be tormenting for a person too. And we look at a lot of these cases where the person ends up in a suspicious death at the end, right? And a lot of times it is ruled suicide. Well, what happens if these people cannot deal with it anymore and they do take their own lives?
Either way, it becomes a very tragic and impactful.
It becomes tragic, right?
Yeah.
True or not, whether he believes what he says or not, Mr. Hall took a risk by coming forward and stating this is true. there have been consequences. He's been subjected to ridicule, and we could probably assume that that's going to be his legacy now, is that you weren't just a writer, you were a writer that then said it was all true. You take a risk by doing that, and I think it's something that should be noted. Maybe there are financial incentives, maybe there aren't, but, I don't see any big major Hollywood deals being struck over this story right now. He's not buying an island off of it. So either way, there's a risk involved in that, and I think that should be noted when we talk about this stuff. Whether or not Charles Hall's claims are fictitious or based in reality, they present us with a striking conversation on the topic of human and extraterrestrial interaction. We might thank him for opening the door to this line of speculation, and we might dig a little bit deeper and wonder what secrets are still hidden at Area 51 and Nellis Air Force Base.